And let me share my screen. That's not what I want to share. This is what I want to share. Okay.
Be careful what you share.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I did see a report today in the news. Apparently, some Canadian member of parliament walked by his camera during a parliament session and he was not wearing any clothes. He'd just come out of the shower or something. And the whole parliament saw this. So I'm sure that'll make the headlines tomorrow. I think it happened yesterday or today. Yeah. Whatever.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So we're all the way up to Kings. We're here. We're basically at the halfway mark. And of course, next week, I will not be teaching. There's a special program with Dr. Tani of UNC Wilmington on, I think, Jewish humor is his topic.
Mhm.
So I encourage you to attend that as well. So just to remind you, we're talking about the Tanakh. I like to review this so that by the end of the class, if nothing else, by the end of the 9 weeks, you all know this, right? That it's Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And of course, we're now talking about the prophets, the middle section of Ketuvim. And we are in still what's called the former prophets. And we're in the last two books of Kings 1 and 2. In Hebrew, we call it Malachim, Aleph, and Bet. A melech is a term you probably know, like David Melech Israel. Malachim is the plural. And a reminder also that Shmuel, Aleph, and Bet, and Malachim, Aleph, and Bet were originally one book, and then they were split at some point. And today, basically, I think everywhere that you would ever look, they are in two books. So where did we leave off? We left off with this great sculpture, Michelangelo's sculpture of David. We're at the end of the books of Samuel, and David's story is basically over. He's not dead yet, but basically his narrative is over, and this is where we pick up. Now, there's a huge amount of information in the books of Kings, and one of the things that I unfortunately do a disservice to our children, but we don't see our children that often, is if they know the kings of Israel, they know Saul, David, and Solomon. Zehu, that's it. Well, that's far from it. As we'll see, we won't be able to address all of them, but it is a rich story. When I often teach it, I often say that it reminds me of Shakespeare, except of course, Shakespeare probably got it from the Bible, right? Like, well, the Bible clearly came first, and Shakespeare probably knew his Bible. But when you see, if you read word for word through these stories, the intrigue is amazing. And one of the interesting things with the books of Kings, this is like the last of the historical narrative books. After this, we'll get to the prophets, and then you really need a Bible scholar to be able to do what's called intertextuality, which is to take the writings of this prophet and where does it fit into the narrative, and the writings of this prophet and where does it fit into the narrative. And it can be very confusing to the uninitiated. But so right now we're still doing a sort of a historical narrative. Okay. And also, just the term, the kings of Israel is misleading, because Israel is not one thing. As we'll see, as soon as it wasn't one thing before David, it was the confederation of the 12 tribes, sort of 12 tribes. They were tribal little nation states, and they didn't always get along. And David sort of brought them together, but again, as I told you last time, a little bit like Camelot, like it didn't exactly exist. And then as soon as Solomon's reign is over, it completely splits. And we're talking about two kingdoms, a kingdom in the north, you'll see a map in a second, called Israel, and a kingdom in the south called Judah. Now, it's very interesting. Judah is the kingdom that survives. We come from the kingdom of Judah, and yet we took the name Israel, right? That is sort of the unifying name. So sometimes you're talking about the kingdom of Israel. Which kingdom are you talking about? The books are probably a compilation of sources. Most of the books of the Bible are, but this one even more so. And the interesting thing here is that whoever put this together, and of course, it's so amazing to me, we don't have information on who put these things together. So you can call the person the compiler, the redactor, a word that used to drive me crazy. It took me years to get used to saying that, or the editor, which is a term that makes more sense to me. This person actually lists the sources that he used. There's something called the books of the Acts of Solomon, and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And we don't have any of these books. We don't know what they are. We have nothing. They weren't found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We found no fragments of them. We have nothing. But clearly in the text, it says, and we'll see in a little bit, oh, as it's written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And we're saying, okay, where is it? No clue. Noted in the Jewish Encyclopedia, even though I said this is an historical narrative, it's the last one, it's not the purpose of this book to be a history book. And it's a very interesting issue, because if you're linear at all, like I am, you want things to go in order, you want to see the history marching on. That was not what the book was written for. It was a recording of the times. And they had agendas for what they were writing. Of course, as we know, the victor writes the history. So there's a little bit of that comes into play. And as we'll see at the very end of the Tanakh, the book of the Chronicles rewrites a lot of things to paint it in a better light. So when were the books written? Most scholars believe it was written during the exile in Babylonia. Now we're going to end today with the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. That's when the exile begins. One could argue that it begins a little bit earlier, but we'll go with 586. And they're in exile for about 50 years, at which point they are given permission to go back and rebuild the temple. They're not given their freedom. They're still a Babylonian vassal state, but they are able to go back. But the exile itself isn't said to end, because very few Jews go back 50 years later. If you think of it, in 1948, how many of us picked up and ran to Israel, right? Israel's birthday was today. It's already tomorrow in Israel, but Israel's 73 years old. 73 years ago, very few Americans, there were Americans that did, but very few Jews worldwide picked up and went to Israel, even if they could. Certainly some of them could not. Much of the, even though we don't have the sources that this redactor named, we do have evidence of many of these stories from non-biblical sources, or other than biblical, from other peoples. So, for example, the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, we've got Babylonian writing and records that talk about this. So now we're at a time in the history, and it only gets better, that we really have corroboration. Unlike the Exodus, for which we have no information, right? Now we do see other sources commenting on this. Notice that there are 20 kings of Judah, 19 kings of Israel. So much of these books are about these people, some of whom only ruled for a year or two, some of them who ruled for 40 or 50 years. These are names that you are probably not familiar with. These are, for the most part, these are stories that the average Jew just knows nothing about. And one of the things that sort of how we measure the kings of Israel, what was important, did this king tolerate other gods, either alongside of or in place of the God of Israel? Now, if we're even commenting on that, what does that tell us about what was going on? There were other gods that they were worshiping. Even one of King David's wives, I don't think it was Michal, I'm not sure which one, had an idol in her home. The Bible says was clearly an idol. They came in with Joshua, they conquered the land, they're living amongst their neighbors. It's not so clear that they were this truly monotheistic nation, even at this point. And did he tolerate, or did he actually destroy any of the sacrifices outside Jerusalem? Because we're supposed to be, Jerusalem is the capital. That's King David established as the capital. It's the house of God. And yet the Northern Kingdom doesn't have Jerusalem. The Northern Kingdom, it doesn't have any part of Jerusalem. And there were times even when these two kingdoms were at war with each other. And so what does this mean for the various kingdoms? Okay. And again, just as I mentioned before, the scholars will be quick to tell you there is a Southern bias, not to be like American Southern, but Southern Kingdom bias that we hear in the books. Judah wins out. So we hear Judah's voices. When the redactor put it all together, that's the lens with which the redactor is using. Okay, so we start at the very end of King David. He is old and he is bedridden. There's actually a either creepy or touching story, depending on how you want to look at it, that they brought virgins to sleep with him because he was cold, right? His bones, he was cold to his bones. And, you know, I don't know if you, I mean, I went to camp in Canada. We learned if you sleep naked, you actually can be warmer than if you try to pile on clothes. There's something about your body heat and all kinds of stuff. Not that you sleep naked with another person at camp, but King David did. And his oldest son is Adoniah. The J trips people up all the time. Most of us would pronounce this Adonijah, but the J, like, is a German J, it's a Y sound, so Adoniah, and which means actually like my Lord is God. It was what the name means. It's his oldest son. He claims the throne, but Nathan, who's the prophet that's sort of David's Jiminy Cricket sitting on his shoulder giving him advice, Nathan advises, no, we don't want the oldest son. We want Bathsheba's son, not the one that was conceived originally when he took her when she was still married to her husband, but after David marries her, after he kills off her husband and he marries her, they have Solomon. And Nathan is making the case for Solomon. Now, you know, throughout the Bible, almost never, in fact, I don't know if there's a time when the oldest son inherits or takes on the leadership role. I mean, it's sort of interesting that we still hold on to that, or held on to it through medieval times, and the church held on to it, when clearly in the Bible it never happened. Right. And she says, Bathsheba comes forward and says, yes, actually, once David's dead, David promised that my son would be king. There is no evidence of that promise anywhere in the text. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? Again, the text is not like the court records, but we don't see it. And now, mind you, in this book of the Chronicles, at the end of the Tanakh, it does say something about David's promise. So were they fixing it to make David look better? Did they just have information that they included that the first people didn't? Of course, we don't know for sure. But David does agree Solomon will be the next king. And David gives a charge to Solomon before he dies. And he says the following words, which I don't have in front of you, I don't think. He says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in God's ways, to keep God's statutes and God's commandments and God's ordinances and God's testimonies, according to that which is written in the law of Moses, in order that you may succeed in whatever you undertake and wherever you turn. So he basically says to his son, stay Jewish, right? Like there's a point here. We made a deal with God. I didn't always honor it. Things went bad. You got to honor it. Things will go well with you. And just before he dies, he gives Solomon's my favorite part. He basically gives Solomon a hit list of who to kill. Like, and these are the following people that were mean to me in my life, and you should go and kill them. It's like something out of The Godfather or something. So Solomon, one of the first things he winds up doing is killing his brother Adoniah, and others who supported that throne. So, you know, again, this is where the Shakespeare comes out, where you've got these royal brothers killing each other. There's a whole story behind this with the brothers, and it's ugly, and he kills several people, even people that there's a verse in there where it talks about someone going into the sanctuary, the temple, and holding onto the horns of the altar. The altar has these horns at the ends, and that image is someone holding on. And this is where we get the word sanctuary, not for the room, but when you seek sanctuary, when you're running from, you know, danger, and you run into a church or synagogue to seek sanctuary. It's this image from the Bible of them holding onto the altar to be safe. Solomon killed them even holding onto the altar. That didn't stop Solomon. He marries a daughter of Pharaoh in Egypt, which is a problem because throughout our history from the Exodus, we're told never to go back to Egypt. And yet he does as a political alliance thing. He builds his own palace and the house of the Lord. He builds eventually, of course, the temple, and he constructs walls around Jerusalem to make it safer. He asks for and is granted wisdom. Now, this is a big deal because we talk about Solomon as being one of our wisest kings, or the wisest man in the world. And he actually, it's like a cartoon, like, right, when the genie comes and says, what do you wish for? And Solomon asked for wisdom. And God said, because you asked for this, I will grant it to you. And right after this, we have the story that you probably all know about the two women fighting over the single child and the wisdom of Solomon to figure out how to discern. Now, what we don't always tell the Hebrew school kids, these were two prostitutes. So these were two women whose word would not necessarily be trusted in court. There are more levels to this story than this nice little fable that we tell children. But it's one of the examples, and there are others in the text of his wisdom. And then, there we go. And then the building of the temple. Now, it lasts until, well, this says 587, but 586 BCE is when it's destroyed. And this, I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but this is a picture of a model that originally was at a place called the Holy Land Hotel. When I went to Israel back in 72, that's where we saw it. But it is now at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And this is how big it is. You can see from the people, this is a model, a scale model of ancient Jerusalem in the time of the temple of King Solomon. And it is really something to behold. If you are planning a trip anytime soon, and Israel, I think, is sort of opening up. I went to the model as a teenager, of course, with our madrichim, with our counselors. And I'm sure we had a tour guide who remembers I was 17. But when I went the last time, when I took these pictures, I went, my mother's first cousin is a docent at the museum, and she met us for the day. And it definitely makes huge difference, I think, anything in a museum when you go with the docent. So I can't strongly recommend enough that if you're going to visit here, that you do that. And here you see just another view. The western wall would be along here. What today is the western wall of the Temple Mount. This area here is called the City of David, Ir David. And it's you can't exactly see it, but it's a slope down to the temple, and then you go up again into the Temple Mount. And this is going to become very important, this topography, when we get to the end of the story in 586 BCE. Okay, so Simon becomes very wealthy, hugely wealthy. I wanted to mention about the building of the temples. You may remember we talked about a king's charter in Samuel, and it's also referenced in Deuteronomy. And it says in the text, you can have a king, but they're going to take your sons and your daughters and your wealth, and they're going to tax you. And that's what happened. Solomon was ruthless. Hard taxes. It says he had a stable of 40,000 horses, forced labor everywhere. He basically completely raided the hills of Lebanon for cedar wood for the temple. We talk about the cedars of Lebanon. It sounds so lovely. Environmentally, it was a horrible, horrible thing. And throughout the building of the temple, they discuss all this astounding, these numbers are beyond our belief. And they constantly refer to Solomon's wisdom. Like, it's so interesting. They talk about this despot, this dictator in so many ways, and but he was very wise. And they just keep weaving it in as if to convince themselves or us that Solomon was good. I have my questions about it. He becomes very, yeah, please.
This is not the story that I think any of us know about Solomon. I mean, I'm like aghast.
Well,
I thought he was, beyond wise, besides wise, I thought he was, kind and whoa.
Look, I'm sure there were kind, but when you read it word for word, as I did, I sort of have gone on a journey with this, right? Because you have your stories that you learn as a kid, then you read it word for word a few times, and you're thinking, whoa, who are these people? And then you come back to a place, and I'm sort of getting there now, where you put it in context, you understand that it's history, nothing is ever as simple as it seems, and I've calmed down a little bit, but yeah, it's rough. In fact, it's the Queen of Sheba, not Bathsheba, but the Queen of Sheba that comes up from Egypt and is, or Ethiopia or somewhere. She's a woman of color, and she wants to see this wise man, and she puts him through a few tests, and he passed all the tests, and she just showers him with wealth from all of Africa, jewels and gold and silver and whatever they're mining there on the backs of slaves in Africa. And let's see. The temple took about 20 years to build. And as I said, it really, like, I don't know how many of you read The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. It's part of a trilogy. It's a great book. The Pillars of the Earth came out a long time ago. And then there was a sequel. I didn't love it as much. And then the prequel just came out this past year. Ken Follett, Follet. And it's historical fiction. And it's about the first book is about the building of a cathedral in medieval England. And it takes 100 years. And so you're going through these generations. And boy, these magnificent cathedrals that as tourists we all want to go and see were really built on the backs of the peasants. I mean, these people suffered terribly so that a few people could build these huge monuments. Well, the same is true with Solomon, right? So these medieval buildings, they learn their lessons well from the Bible. So he becomes very wealthy. And in fact, it says, they say he exceeded all the kings of the earth in both riches and wisdom. And they're always seeking to balance that. Like they don't want us to judge him too harshly, right? But here's another piece that stopped me in my tracks. Okay, so 700 wives, 300 concubines, right? In addition to his 40,000 horses and these magnificent stables, he's got 1,000 women. And they're not all from within the fold, so to speak. And notice this little line here. And his wives turned away his heart. When you marry people, all of us, different customs, all of us from our families bring things together. Usually we blend them together. But if it's something that's very different from where you come from, it changes things. And this is part of Solomon's downfall, that they sneak in just in a quiet line. They don't talk about it very much. But with all these wives, yes, there were idolatrous practices, and there were things going on that should not have been. Okay, at the end of chapter 11.
Question?
Yeah, please.
What does it mean? And his wives turned away his heart?
Meaning they, I mean, very blatantly. So if they weren't Jewish, they're luring him to their way of doing things, right? Not deviously necessarily, but it's just part of the reality, right? You know, my mother was, her father was Turkish, and my father was, you know, good old sort of Russian, whatever. And my grandfather and his cousins and friends, boy, when they partied, they looked like Turks. They danced with money on their foreheads and like belly dancing. And there's this great picture from their wedding album of my grandfather and my uncle Leon with the kerchief, but no, not the kerchief, the money, and they're dancing. And I looked at my mom, and my father's family, they came pretty much earlier. They came in the 1880 kind of pogrom era. And they were very, as far as I was concerned, very white bread American Jews. And I remember saying to my mom, well, what did Daddy's family say when they were dancing like that? And she said, oh, they just sat there horrified.
You have to know her mother, guys.
So, I mean, my mother was raised in the States, so there wasn't such a culture clash. But certainly my grandfather, who was Turkish and met this lovely Polish Jew in Havana, there was plenty of culture class in the home my mother grew up in. Anyway, so that's what that means about the people in their hearts. So we get to the end of chapter 11. He's reigned for 40 years. It's a good long run. And then a very common language that you see is that he slept with his fathers, meaning he died. Okay, and he's buried, and his son reigns in his stead. Now, you've probably never heard of Rehoboam. Or Rehavam, and that's because everything went, as I said, kablooey as soon as Solomon died. There are challenges to the tree, there are to the throne, and everything splits. Now, before we dispose of Solomon completely, we do have 3 major works in the Bible attributed to Solomon. The first is the Song of Songs, which is quite erotic love poetry. The rabbis included it, saying it's the love between God and the people Israel. I really don't think that's how it was written, but whatever, that allowed them to include it. And we often recite part of it at Passover, because that's when we became a people, and it's this marriage sort of between God and the people Israel. And they say that Solomon wrote that as a young man, right, with lust in his heart. Then we have the book of Proverbs, which we say he probably wrote in his, his 30s, 40s, right? When you're old enough to know that, oh, my parents weren't so dumb, right? You're past your rebellious years, you sort of have some wisdom, and he writes what's called Mishlei, or the book of Proverbs. And then at the very end of his life, the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes is attributed to him, which we read at Sukkot. And it is actually, it's my favorite book of the Bible, but many people see this very depressing, as a person at the very end of life saying, well, what's the point? I just lived all these years. We have the phrase from this book, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, what goes around comes around, right? And you may as well eat, drink, and be merry, because there's nothing else in life. When we get to Ecclesiastes, I'll share with you some other opinions about it. I think it's a brilliant book. So I think Proverbs may say that it was written by Shlomo, by Solomon. Ecclesiastes does not. It says it was written by this guy named Kohelet, and people assume that was Solomon. I don't know. We take that as legend regardless, but those are attributed to Solomon in his wisdom. And just to show you how amazing it is, I know it's a little hard to read, but up here is Saul. He had a son that did not inherit the throne. Instead, David did. David gave the throne to Solomon. David fought against his son Absalom. It was a horrible war. And this is Adoniah that Solomon killed. Solomon has this son, and there is a line that goes down through Solomon, but there's a whole nother line of the kings of Israel, because the northern part of the land said, we don't recognize you. You don't represent us. And they formed their own kingdom with their own capital. And again, most of these names you have not heard. Some of them you have, and we'll talk about King Ahab, who's one of the more well-known right here, King Ahab and Jezebel, names that we know, courtesy of modern literature. Well, not so modern, but literature and movies. And you'll notice that this line stops. This line also stops, because there is an end to the kingdom with the fall of the temple. Okay, so there's another, so this is what the kingdoms look. Yeah, please, Naomi, do you have a question?
Your past slide, over here, what was it? Did they intermarry with under Jezebel in green?
Right, yes, Jezebel, right. Jezebel had a daughter that married into the southern kingdom. But there was like infighting within the families. I mean, there was some alliances, there were some battles between them. So it does look like, but it's a daughter who doesn't inherit from her father anyway, right? So, but yes, so there is a relationship there. And I don't even know what these double arrows are talking about. I do know this one, because Yehoiachin changes his name to Tzidkiyahu. It's the same person. So, but I, so I didn't make up the chart, but so there's a lot of confusion in it. But here are the kingdoms. Again, these are not, this is a website I very rarely take from Christian websites, but they do often have the best supplies. The so-called United Kingdom under David, if you recall, the 12 tribes, we had 2 tribes that settled over on the east side of the Jordan. All the rest of the tribes are here. They never captured this area, which is essentially today the Gaza Strip, called Philistia, which is where we get the name Palestine eventually from. The Romans use that word. And it goes way farther north into Lebanon than we do now. And then when it splits right here. Jerusalem is basically the northern part of the split. And this top is the northern kingdom, and the bottom is the southern kingdom. Now, Judah is the name of one of the tribes. In the southern kingdom, you've got the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Judah is the larger of the two, and that's what the kingdom gets called. Israel, it's just that they're all the children of Israel, right? Who is Jacob's changed name. They're Bnei Israel. So they took the name Israel. When we'll see, when Israel falls, it's still the kingdom of Judah, but eventually over time, we then become the nation of Israel again. Now there's a little bit of confusion we'll see later on, because it looks like Simon, the tribe of Simon, is also based down here, but I researched and really couldn't find answers. So I have to make a few phone calls and ask a few teachers of mine to understand that better for you. So we're going to talk about Ahab and Jezebel. There's stories with all of these kings, and there's a lot of really weird stories with these kings. I mean, really weird stories. of their deaths, of their intrigue, of their backfighting. Lots of praise for David throughout. But there's this seesaw effect, much like we had with the judges. If there's a judge in the land, everything's good. No judge, everything goes bad. Well, this king is good and followed the ways of the Lord. Now his son is king. He ignored the way of the Lord and he allowed idols, right? And then his son is born and maybe he went back to following the king and destroyed the idols. And then the next guy follows the idols. And it's a constant back and forth. And the text actually says, this king did what was good in the eyes of the Lord, or this king did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And they make it very clear. You can make a chart, which are the good guys and which are the bad guys. So Ahab is basically the bad guy. And he marries Jezebel, who's a foreign princess. And they're at the same time as Elijah the prophet. Just to see a little bit of the tension between Ahab and Elijah, when Ahab sees him, is a great line. He says, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel, right? You rabble rouser, you muckraker." To which Elijah answers very haughtily, "I'm not the troublemaker, you are." Elijah's not a really nice guy, very full of himself, very haughty, but very true to God. Jezebel brings her foreign gods with her. Not only that, but she brings her own prophets with her who are in the palace. Complete corrupt governance, even to a really weird story where Ahab wants a vineyard and the seller doesn't want to sell it, and so they have him killed, right? So that Ahab can now have the vineyard. And there's very weird stories about Elijah also. I don't know how many of you remember Fantasia, the sorcerer's apprentice scene in Fantasia. So there twice we have this. First one is with Elijah, where there's an endless supply of flour and oil, right? This woman is in need and she's praying and she's so earnest, and Elijah like clicks his fingers or wrinkles his nose like bewitched, and lo and behold, no matter how much flour she takes out of the container, there's more flour. There's a story of Elijah bringing a child back to life. And we'll see echoes of this story with the next prophet. And then, let's see, what's the next click? In chapter 18 of this book is, to me, the famous story. I call it the showdown at Mount Carmel. This is sort of east of Haifa. Maybe you'll know the story, where Elijah thinks he's the only prophet left. He thinks Jezebel has killed all the Jewish prophets, which turns out she has not, but he doesn't know that. And he challenges them sort of to a duel on top of Har Carmel. And he says, okay, I'm going to build an altar right here. And you do the same thing. And then let's pray. I'm going to pray and you're going to pray. And let's see which sacrifice God takes. So the priests of Baal, Jezebel's guys, make this altar. And they're praying and they're dancing and they're gashing themselves with knives. And it's a whole, it's a real great Hollywood moment, and nothing happens. And Elijah taunts them. Well, maybe your God is sleeping. Shout louder. Maybe you have to dance harder, And then it's Elijah's turn. And he not only does the same thing they did, but he does even more. He pours water on his sacrifice, right? So it can't possibly go on fire. And he does all kinds of extra things. And lo and behold, he prays to God, and his sacrifice catches on fire, and everyone's amazed. And then Elijah somehow kills everybody and runs away. But it's a great story to think about. But Elijah, is basically, he says at the end of this, though, God, what are you bothering with these people for? They're not paying attention. You do miracles and they don't listen to you. Okay. And so when it's the end of Elijah's life, the lore is, and it's in the text, he doesn't die. You can see here it says, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into the heavens. He doesn't die. He just goes up in this fiery chariot. So we don't know what happened to Elijah. But one of the things that I like to think about with this is that we interact with Elijah 3 times in our general lives, right? So when do we talk about Elijah generally? We just had one recently.
Passover.
Right, Passover, right? You open the door for Elijah. When else? Right, I think I heard it. Say it louder.
the Saturday closing of services.
Exactly. When you do Havdalah, you sing Eliyahu Hanavi. Some people sing it before Havdalah, some people after. And there's a third time. Who here had a son? At the baby's bris, there is a chair for Elijah. Okay. At the baby's bris, there's always a chair set aside for Elijah. So there was a beautiful story I once heard that Elijah goes up to heaven at this point and says, God, I've had it with these people, right? They're never going to follow you. Go make a new world, like start over again. This is just not worth it. And God basically says, oh, ye of little faith, I'll show you. I know these people have good in them. And you, Elijah, will now wander the earth for all time. And you will visit every time a baby boy is born. And you will visit every time the Jews end the Sabbath. And you will visit at every Seder. And you will see that they're still Jewish. And it's a really nice thought, right? No matter how far away we are from Judaism, we're still here, guys. You know, no matter how secular your Seder was or wasn't, we're still here. So I really love that. Now, there are all kinds of legends because Elijah didn't die. There's all kinds of Yiddish folktales and others, you know, a beggar in town and some miracle happens and he disappears and they realize it must have been Elijah, right? So he's sort of the perpetual wandering Jew. And the last piece of Elijah is the lore is that he is going to announce the Messiah. So that's sort of the less glamorous reason that he appears at these times, because when a baby boy is born, maybe this will be the Messiah. At the end of Shabbat, God, wouldn't this be a good week for the Messiah to come? And then at Pesach also, look, as long as we're celebrating our nationhood, we're ready for the Messiah, God, let Elijah come and tell us that the Messiah is coming. And I don't know about you. My mother once had a Kiddush cup that had a leak in it, and even she didn't realize it. And we weren't paying any attention. And we went to the door to open for Elijah. We come back and look at the cup, and it's actually lower. And there's a huge wine stain all over the tablecloth. Anyway, so there are lovely, lovely stories of Elijah that are good, but there's a lot of Elijah that wasn't so lovely. Okay, so Elijah passes off the mantle to a guy named Elisha. And it's very disconcerting that their names are so similar. And actually their stories are very similar. Elisha sort of apprenticed under Elijah. He also does some miracles. He also has like an apprentice sorcerer, the sorcerer's apprentice kind of story. He also brings a child back to life. And he's basically a good guy, except for this story. So anybody want to read the English out loud? Anybody feel like reading? Michelle, go ahead.
And he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And he looked behind him and saw them and cursed them in the name of Adonai.
You keep going, we have a little feedback, it's okay.
And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood and mangles 42 children.
Yeah, and the Hebrew is actually a little bit even more violent. She basically tears apart these children who had mocked him, who had teased him. So, you know, you've got this, Alicia's so nice and so great, and then you have this story, and you have to scratch your head and think, really? This, you know, this is really what happens? And of course, we have the seesaw behavior of the kings. They war with each other. They're good kings, they're bad kings. Sometimes we have the details, and sometimes it says, and this is recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel, and of course we don't have that. And some of them really strayed far. And by chapter 16, we meet the Assyrians. We'll see a map of where they are. They're basically to the northeast, and they eventually will conquer the northern kingdom. And within a chapter, it's all over. They have been conquered. And I just want to look at this with you. It's actually, they make no bones about why this happened. The king of Assyria took Samaria, the northern kingdom is often called Samaria, and carried Israel away to Assyria, placed them in Hala, in the harbor, on the river, etc. And it was so because, right? So the redactor of the Bible wants you to know why were they conquered? The children of Israel had sinned against Adonai their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. So this constant refrain, if you don't abide by the rules, guys, it's not going to go well for you. Now that all is fine until we get to modern day. And I hear people say things like, well, the Holocaust happened because Jews weren't religious enough. And that I have a little bit of trouble with this whole attitude. So here's some of the maps to show you. So we have, this is where you see the Simon tribe, and I don't understand because Simon is not mentioned anywhere in the Southern Kingdom, but clearly they're located here. So the kingdom of Benjamin and Judah are down south, all the other tribes are here. The Assyrian Empire is basically this orangey area. The Assyrians never conquered Judah, but the Babylonians do right after them. The Babylonians take over from the Assyrians, and the Babylonians conquer Judah. And here you see the red line shows you that what used to happen when you were conquered was the conquering people would come and take you out of your land and relocate you, right? They couldn't keep guards on these people. These people were going to rebel, right? Or they wouldn't worship the right king. So they physically took you out of your land. They spread you out so that you would assimilate as quickly as possible. And this green line, they would move other people into your lands, right? This was common for all of the nations at this time. And this conquering of the Northern Kingdom, these are the 10 lost tribes of Israel that we talk about. And let me just, so who are the 10 lost tribes? Where are they? We don't know. We truly don't know. There are all kinds of interesting theories that they wound up going to what today we would call Iraq or Iran, but they eventually wound up in Ethiopia or Uganda, right? There's a great, somebody's theory that they kept going east and eventually went across the Bering Straits, and the Native Americans are remnants of the 10 lost tribes. My father had a great story about that. I'll tell you sometime. But we don't know what happened to them, except that they're lost to us. All we have left now are the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south. Okay. So then several generations later, we get to a good king, Hezekiah. And he lived during the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. He saw it. And he knows Syria is on the attack. Now he's got Isaiah, the prophet. It's now the time of Isaiah, and Isaiah is his Jiminy Cricket sitting on his shoulder, telling him what to do. And he witnesses the fall of the Northern Kingdom. And we know, not necessarily from this book, but from the later book of Chronicles at the end of the Tanakh, that Hezekiah made incredible improvements to the city. And not only improvements like fortifying it, but he also established a secure water source. Any time a nation would go to conquer another nation, they would place the city under siege. First thing they do is they cut off your food and water. So this is known as the tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel, or the pool of Siloam. You see down here, this is Jerusalem, this is the Temple Mount. The Western Wall would be up here. And there was a spring just outside the city walls. And he built these tunnels. And I don't know these people. I just found these pictures on the internet. I did go through these tunnels as a teenager. I would never do it again. I have like nightmares of going through that tunnel. In my travel diary, it says it was wonderful. I don't believe my 17-year-old words. Not only is it this narrow, sometimes you're bending down, there's water. This is water up to your knees. You go with flashlights, you go with a tour guide. It is not for the faint of heart. And it's quite a long walk, and you wind up in the Siloam Pool, which is part of East Jerusalem, which politically there are all kinds of issues anyway now. But it was quite an engineering feat that's talked about by all of the ancient peoples, because he found a way for the city of Jerusalem to have water even when they were under siege by the Assyrians. Okay, so Assyria then does capture territory in Judah. So they're right there at the brink, and Hezekiah wisely makes a deal with them. He basically bribes them and with riches from the temple, and he buys a little bit of time. But Assyria continues to march towards Jerusalem over time and challenges them, saying, God didn't save your cousins in the north. Your God's not going to save you either. But Isaiah the prophet is there, and he bolsters up Hezekiah and says, don't be afraid. God will protect you. And there is this episode where God apparently kills off 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. And then because of this, there is chaos, and the king at the time, the king's sons actually kill their own father. So now the Assyrians are without leadership, and that leads way for the Babylonians to take over the Assyrians. Okay, so then in chapter 20, here's an example where it says the rest of the acts and how he was great and how he made this water are written in, we know this because aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Well, they might be, we don't know, right? That's one of those examples of where it just says we don't know. After Hezekiah, he's got a son who's a bad guy, and I think another son who only rules for a couple of years. It's pretty bad. But then we get to Josiah, and this is where we're going to sort of end he ends the story, the big story. I mean, we'll end a little bit past with the destruction of the temple. Josiah is the greatest guy ever. My first reading through the text in English, page by page, I got to Josiah and I was enthralled. First of all, he's a good guy. He's third in line after Hezekiah, about 57 years later. Hezekiah's first son rules for like 50 years or so, and the second guy not so long. He was only 8 years old when he inherits the kingship. And he's raised by his mother. There's all kinds of issues, but eventually he begins repairing the temple, which tells us the temple was in disrepair. But so that's a good sign of one of the good guys when they pay attention to the temple. But then this really interesting episode happens. And do I have someone that wants to read in the English? Can you see it well enough? Diane, you had your hand up before. You want to do some reading? And don't worry about the people's names. You can even skip them if you want to.
Okay, then the high priest Hilkiah said to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it.
Okay, wait, hold on. What did he find? What do you mean a scroll of the teaching of the Lord? What would you think that is?
The Torah.
Yeah, what do you mean he found the Torah? Where was it? Did they not have it? Did they not know about it? It like reminds me of a Star Trek episode or something, right? When they get to a lost world and they find the Constitution or something. Like, what do you mean you found it? And Shaphan tells the king, and then the king hears the words. Read verse 11, Diane.
Okay, when the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes.
What is rending your clothes? What does that mean when you rent your clothes?
Well,
Yeah, and why do you do this? What's it a sign of?
That's death. Somebody died.
Mourning, death, sorrow, despair. He hears the words of the Torah and he is overcome. What has become of them that they've strayed so far, maybe? Now, the scholars argue, what did they actually find? Many of the scholars believe they found the book of Deuteronomy, not the whole of the scroll, but we don't know. We just have no idea. And then he goes and says to the prophets, go ask of the Lord on behalf of all of us. God must be really angry with us because we've not been obeying the words of this scroll. We lost the law and now we have it again. I talk about born again, right? It's an amazingly powerful moment. And for me, it was transformative. I mean, you have to like sit up and say, whoa, we think Judaism's bad now. We think people are assimilating. We're worried about world Jewry. Hello, right? This is nothing new. They go and consult Huldah, the prophet, actually not Isaiah, and she does all kinds of prophecies, and she tells him that Jerusalem actually will be conquered, but don't worry because God will still be with you. And it happens after the time of Josiah. So Josiah goes about cleaning the house. He tears down all the foreign shrines and the altars. I mean, he's on a mission now, right? He found the word of God. It's no joke. And he's going to do it right. And then this one, which really astounds me. Anybody else want to read? Yeah, please. Naomi, go ahead. And verse 21. Oh, wait, Naomi, you're muted. Sorry.
The king commanded all the people, offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God, as prescribed in this scroll of the covenant. Now the Passover sacrifice had not been offered in that manner in the days of the chieftains who ruled Israel, or during the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And I can't see any.
Oh, sorry, that's okay. The next verse isn't even important, but they weren't, we just had Passover. We talk about how we'll never forget the Exodus. We also have to remember the Exodus. The Passover sacrifices, Paschal lamb that they would do, that they sacrificed in the temple. The rabbis of the Talmud talk about it ad nauseum. They were not doing it, guys, for a long time.
They really strayed. They really strayed. I mean, it's like they're not even Jewish.
Well, and there are academicians that say, you know what? Judaism was actually invented here. That what happened before, it's like romantic that they were Jews. They were all kinds of idolatrous worshiping people, and Judaism starts here with Josiah. It's just a fascinating little piece of our history that most of us just don't know about. And they say of Josiah, there's no king before, this is really powerful, no king like him before who turned back to the Lord with, look at this, with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might. What's that come from? Right, that's the V'ahavta, right? And it's, here you have the words in Hebrew. It's slightly different grammar, but it's so that a poetic reference, right, that we had earlier in the Torah is still one that is being used. But God, and he says, and in full accord with the teaching of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Josiah, that we've never really heard about, is this amazing king that the text loves, and even the rabbis give him short shrift. He does die. He doesn't accomplish his goals. He keeps the line going. He brings us back. But God does destroy. Well, according to tradition, God allowed Judah to be destroyed, right? We would say, well, they didn't have a good enough army. But if you're faithful and you believe that God has a hand in all of this, God allowed it to be destroyed. Okay, and then Josiah is killed in a battle with Egypt. Oh, so then you've got, if you picture the map, you've got, I don't know if I'm doing it backwards or forwards, but you've got the Babylonians coming down towards the southwest, and you've got the Egyptians coming up from the southwest. That really Israel becomes this pawn in the middle. Israel occupies a lot of the seacoast, and for much of its history, it's a battle. We'll see it again, well, not in our course, but you see it again in the time of Alexander the Great and the story of Hanukkah. It's this constant struggle from sort of the Iran-Iraq area and Egypt, all wanting to fight over that little sliver of land that we call the Middle East. And so there's another king that comes up for a few months. He's not a great guy, and he's actually imprisoned in Egypt. And then Egypt actually sends a puppet king, and he sort of is in cahoots with Egypt, but it's not good. Like, they think they'll be saved if they ally themselves with Egypt, but Egypt's also not a good ruler. So then comes Nebuchadnezzar, which is everyone's hated word. You can't look at it. You just have to say it if you know it. If you try to read the English, it doesn't work. And he is the head of Babylonia. In 597 BCE, there's the king on the throne of Judah is Jehoiachin, and he's actually carted off to Babylon. It's almost professional courtesy. The king doesn't destroy him. It's like a warning. King to king, you're not on the throne anymore. I'm taking you to my place. And he puts him in prison. He treats him well, by the way, because he's a king. And he thinks that now this nation of Judah without their king will fall apart. But they don't. But they took Jehoiachin along with his mother, servants, princes, and officers, all of the upper echelon. By the way, this was a move that the Nazis did when they conquered Poland. Before they went into Poland, they took out the upper echelon of folks, the wealthy, the professors, the academics. They carted them off first. And so when they were able to just overrun Poland because there was nobody there to rise up or to stop them. The scholars think, and the book says, perhaps 10,000 in all were carted off. This is before the destruction. And also treasures from the temple. Nebuchadnezzar appoints his own puppet king, a Jewish guy. Again, something the Nazis would do, right? When they would put someone in charge of the ghetto. His name is changed to Tzidkiyahu or Tzedekah. He's not such a great guy. He's not terrible, but he's not great. He rebels though against Babylonia. He's like, I don't know, I want to say he wasn't a bright guy. Like, Babylonia put you in power. Couldn't you like finagle some kind of good relationship? And instead you rebel against them. And so here we have, in very blatant and very sad language, that's the 7th of the 5th month. And we know the date as being the 9th of Av. That's something for another discussion. But that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Nabuzaradan, who's the chief officer, comes to Jerusalem. He burns the house of the Lord, the king's palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. He burned down the house of every notable person. And it's all over. It's gone. Just like that. Just like that. Reviewing, I'm sorry, Steve Kiahu is carted off, as well as all the other people. They're not all killed necessarily. But when they get to Babylon, it's not great, but it's not terrible either, because again, the Babylonians are relocating them. They're not throwing them into prison as slaves necessarily. And certainly he treats with professional courtesy the kings. And the Jews live in Babylon and continue to live in Babylon up until modern times. Thriving academies of Jewish learning in the area that we call Babylon went on for 1,000 years, 2,000 years almost. And but this is the end of the first temple. It just is. So I found this nice little thing. I don't know my ages, but apparently this is the Second Iron Age. Just to give you a timeline, 1000 BCE, David conquers Jerusalem. 960 is Solomon. And we're going backwards, right? Because these are like negative numbers. 722 is when the Assyrians cart off the 10 tribes. And 586, which is like 50 years later, I think. 50 years later? Yeah, I think it's, no, more than that.
No, 100.
150.
100.
I don't go backwards anymore so well. Anyway, Babylonian forces destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And that's the end of the book of Kings. Done. And that's the end of the historical narrative in the Bible. When we get to our next class, we'll look at the named prophets. And again, this is where it gets a little confusing because time-wise, they overlap with all that we've learned. So we're not going to really be talking about history. We'll be talking really about their message, their raison d'etre, their what they're known for is basically what we're going to work on. So that's it for this week. A couple of announcements. Maybe Michelle, you might make them, or do you want me to make them?
Oh, you can make them.
So Friday night, 6 o'clock, our regular service time at B'nai Israel. Margot Wagner, who's the young intern from the Institute for Southern Jewish Living, where we partner with them for education. She will be with us via Zoom, and she will be leading Friday night services in celebration of Israel's birthday. You can see my Israeli flag behind me. Israel is now 73 years old, and we know that this is still a miracle, and it's also not a given that Israel will survive forever. So it's still something worth noting. Margot's young. She's going to be entering cantorial school in the fall. She's got a lovely voice, and I know she's put together a very creative service for us. That's 6 o'clock on Friday night. And then on Shabbat morning, in addition to our regular service, Margot will be giving a Devar Torah, and she will be chanting Musaf. She'd probably be mortified if I told you this, but she grew up in the Reform movement, and they don't have Musaf. And she's been studying really hard to learn to chant Musaf, which is a good thing for her. She's going to cantorial school. She needs to be well versed. So I'm very impressed with her and her desire to learn more about the breadth of Judaism. So she'll be with us on Shabbat morning, and then Sunday morning she's doing a program for the kids. I've sent information to the parents, and I'll send a reminder again tomorrow. Anything else?
I just have a quick question. If since this is being recorded, if people want to watch it, how do you find it? Do you go to our YouTube channel? Or?
Yeah, so the first 3 weeks are on the YouTube channel. I've converted the 4th week. I just haven't loaded it up there. I don't know why, but every time I do this, I have to reteach myself how to do it. So I need to like block out time. But yes, it's on the B'nai Israel YouTube channel. And I could probably give a link to the office if they want to put it in the announcements, so people can just link to it easily.
Okay. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I guess the only thing I would add to what you said about this weekend is that it's only going to be on Zoom on Friday, but Saturday will be on Zoom and in person. Margot won't be in person, but she'll be joining us via the technology of Zoom. So she's in Jackson, Mississippi.
Exactly. Diane?
Can I ask a quick question? Is there any information about why we chose Israel as the name for the land and chose Jews for us? Why not Israelites or why not Judea?
Right, so that's a really good question. I don't have an answer for you. It's something I'll look into.
Okay.
My guess is that there's not a whole lot of solid evidence as to how that evolved. And sometimes it evolves from the outside, that it's not a choice we make, but it's what others call us. But I really don't know.
Okay.
Originally, Abraham, they were called the Ivrim, the Hebrews. And then they were the sons of the children of Israel, right? And they were Israelites. And then they get into Judah and Israel. But we'll see by the time, well, we won't see in our studies, but by the time of the Greeks and Romans, the area is called Judea, right? And my guess is that the term Jew came around then, but we do refer to ourselves as the children of Israel, so that's sort of the nation or something. But I don't have any hard evidence. Michelle, don't you have an annual meeting also on Sunday?
Yeah, so it's basically the semi-annual meeting. It covers from December through now, and that's information is in the newsletter and the links in the newsletter as well. So yes, thank you.
You're welcome. All right,
Hi.
everyone. So I'll see you.
Hello?
Yes,
This
go
is
ahead.
Ellie. Hi. Number one, I clicked the link that was in the newsletter and it came up as being like a bad link. So I apologize for yelling in your ear. When you were talking about the Messiah coming and visiting the Brit,
Yes,
wouldn't it be interesting if the Messiah was a woman?
right. And we don't have a chair
I'm
for
just-
Messiah at a lot of baby namings.
I'm
Absolutely.
just planting that we just assume that the paternalistic based religion continues to have to be paternalistic, and
Absolutely. And I
very
don't
possibly we could change things.
totally. I mean, I don't.
She says with a smile.
I know. I mean, my daughter's 36 years old, and I created what we call the Simchat Bat, which was a ceremony for her on the 8th day to name her. And of course, Rabbi Bender just named Shlomi on the 8th day. And I don't know. I'm gonna have to go back and check my notes if we had a chair for Elijah at my daughter's Simchat Bat. My guess is no, but
No.
I don't know. I was younger and more rebellious then. Who knows? Wait, there's one other thing I was going to comment on. I think that's it. Oh, next week. Don't forget, not my class, but yes, a class with Dr. Tanny. Okay,
Thank
see
you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.